All right, we're going to get started. We thank you for coming today. The Faculty Scholarship Committee is sponsoring a number of speakers this spring semester. We got off to a rolling start last week because we weren't able to get our speaker here, so our premiere is going to be even better. We welcome back an old friend. This is actually a jointly sponsored talk by the Faculty Scholarship Committee and the Center of Civil Law Studies. So we welcome back our old friend Santiago Legarre, who is now visiting at Notre Dame, but he has been in many places. Of course, he's a professor at Catholic University of Argentina. He has visited at LSU. He has visited at Valparaiso. He has been in many places. He's also visited in Kenya at Strathmore Law School. I was going to try to describe the areas in which he is a scholar, but he's kind of omnivorous as a scholar: constitutional law, natural law, international comparative law. He's going to talk today about civil law and common law and LSU's fit in the world. So, Santiago, we welcome you back. It's good to see you, old friend.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure to be back. I mean, to make this talk 2 consecutive years, it must be like a record of sorts, especially if you get more than 3 people. Especially if you get the distinguished persons in the audience, so I'm very grateful. We were talking with Professor Corbett a few minutes ago about a picture he has in his office of our dear Cheney, Joseph, and himself, Bill Corbett, and we were trying to figure how old this picture was. And I thought it would be recent because Cheney looks exactly like I remember him, but then I look at Bill in the picture, and this is clearly an old picture. So he was saying we're getting older.
Thank you.
And in fact, I mean, older is a compliment. That's the thing, you know. You need to read the new psychology books. Older is a compliment, but I won't speak on that, or he might think that I am actually really, someone who reaches far in scholarship terms. So I'll stick to what I was going to say about being older, which I mentioned to him. This will be the first time on Thursday that I'm speaking on Thursday and giving a lecture here for two student groups, and I'm speaking with a student. So I think that's getting older. When you start writing with a student and speaking with a student, and I think it's phenomenal that, as Grace was saying to me earlier, I was lucky enough to be able to spot Chris Handy in 3 weeks of teaching him in the midst of 15 other students, and I'm really, in that respect, proud of myself, and older too, I suppose. Wisdom to delegate parts, less energy, more energy. I think you know all about it. The young ones, the old ones in the room. But furthermore, when I was copied in an email to the faculty with the schedule for this semester, which included last week's canceled talk, I saw that it was one of my students who was presenting for you last week, the one who couldn't come. He's my dear friend and student, and Claire, one of your new hires, was with him at Yale, and it was she, I found out, who invited him. So now, you are in the same kind of circuit with people you taught 20 years ago or something like that, and you're older. And then there is Mariano here, in between two important figures of this faculty, and we also go like I don't know, 15 years back or so, and now he helped organize this talk on Thursday, and he's doing the RLM here. So we are getting older, and that's fantastic. I will open my brief remarks with a quote I found today. That's also getting older. You're more flexible and you can improvise last minute. A line from our dear Julio Cuetorrua. He says in this book, Judicial Methods of Interpretation of the Law, given in 1981, this copy to Pat Martin here by Saul Lipinoff. He says, Julio Cuetorrua, my fellow countryman, professionally trained judges in both civil law and common law countries appear to apply methods of interpretation of law which follow the same basic pattern. You can also tell I'm older because I forgot my glasses, but I can still read, but just, then I'll be older, I will have to go get the glasses. So you could say this article is about developing Cuetorrua's idea, a same basic pattern, the idea of convergence between what we, Chris and I, call a pure common law system of adjudication and a pure civil law system of adjudication. Of course, these don't exist in real fact, the pure civil law or common law. Every instance of a country and of a legal and judicial system and of a system of precedent that you have will not fall in these two. But some will get closer to the pure common law and some closer to the pure civil law system. And then what we want to figure in this research is, where does Louisiana fall? Where does Argentina fall? And where are they with regard to these two? Is Louisiana closer to the pure common law system, or Argentina closer to the pure common law system? Or if you want to ask the same question, which of the two is closer to the pure civil law system? So this is what this is about. We've just submitted the article, but we are pretty sure that it won't go well at the first and only journal to which we have submitted it, which means that if you have suggestions, they will probably not only be interesting, but also very useful for the actual paper. Unless I'm wrong and it goes well, in which case I can still carve them in, perhaps if the tyrants, the students, that is, will, etc. By the way, Bill Corbett read this article. Maybe this is why he invited me. I don't know. But he thought that we were a bit wrong, and he would deny that now, of course, in placing Louisiana too much towards this direction of the spectrum. And he also thought we might be wrong, although he said, and I will respect his saying this, that he was ignorant about Argentina. But if he were to judge from our article, he also thought we were wrong in thinking that Argentina is not here. So we had to struggle with the Corbett edits to our piece, and I repeat now, thanks to him, we actually changed relevantly the argument, also because other people, including Ed Edmonds, who is at Notre Dame, now retired recently. He was the chief librarian there, the head librarian, and he was that as well for 10 years at Loyola in New Orleans, where he taught with Mary Alguero, who is probably the most important article or author with whom we converse in our piece. And I know her in person. I met her in Jerusalem at a conference, and I find her work very enlightening. So anyways, If these are abstract notions, we still would say that countries such as the UK and the USA are very close to the pure common law system when it comes to what I will call tentatively precedent, or when it comes to what is the binding force of past judicial decisions in a system. And just to give you a couple of examples for each, Italy and Spain analogously fall closer, but not quite in the right box, closer than anything else to a pure civil law system. So in the pure civil law system, it would be true that there is no such thing as precedent. So the closer you get to this idea of zero precedent, all the shades of minimal adherence to precedent, the more minimal, the closer it will be to a pure civil law system. Now, Mary Alguero, in her first long article on this, then she published a second one and then a book, which has much to do with legal research methods too, as you know. With my crew here, this corridor. She quotes a Louisiana judge. She did a survey before 2005. And this judge, I'll never forget, I was here when the law review crowd was taking my class in 2005. I had six of them in the class, and they were working on Mary Alguero's article. So I got the scoop. And she said, this judge in New Orleans, I think it was, or maybe Baton Rouge, said, there is no such thing as precedent in Louisiana. So the way he would see it is exactly the opposite of Corbett's. This judge would put here, Louisiana, or even here, zero. This is 0. This is 1. This is 100. This is 95. I'm making up numbers, but so we place instead Louisiana here with jurisprudence constante and what Mary calls systemic respect for jurisprudence in her second long article, which came out 5 years later. I think the first one is 2005. Louisiana Law Review, and the second one, again, Louisiana Law Review, is 2010, I think. And then Argentina, we place in this spot of the range of the spectrum, in other words, closer than Louisiana to the civil law. But at the same time, you can see that Argentina not only doesn't belong to the 0, but also is not with Italy or Spain, or according to this judge, Louisiana. But we think this judge was, in one of these days when you wake up and you want to make a bold statement for some reason. Maybe he had been overruled. I don't know. Because there is a great tension here. I was wondering as I read my good friend Bill's edits, is Bill Corbett a civilian? If maybe Alain Levasseur had read my article, or Saul Litvinov, if he was wrong about heaven and he's reading things in heaven because he's there, as opposed to denying there's anything after death. But, maybe they would disagree with Corbett or Bob Pascal, goes without saying. So what's this SF here? This is the soft obligation system or doctrine that we have in Argentina. Because you know more than I do about this, which is why I hired Handy, he was handy, then I won't talk about that. And I'm happy not to take questions about that. But I will take them. And I'll call him on the phone. and all these guys are. So, Argentina, we have a constitution mimicked from the US Constitution. So this is 1853. Now in the US Constitution, there is no written section on the binding force of precedent, of course, but still the rule of stare decisis, which is the 100 as opposed to the 0 of no stare decisis, this rule that has a vertical and a horizontal dimension, where the vertical one has to do with what I'm talking about more now, hierarchy, higher courts, lower courts, overruling, and the horizontal, yes, overruling, but the same court, Supreme Court, Court of Appeals, whatever, considering its own past decisions. We also did not have in 1853 a written rule of stare decisis, be it vertical or horizontal, in the Argentine Constitution. But because we followed the practices of American constitutional law, our courts at the federal level started to imitate what the Supreme Court would do with lower court decisions that departed from higher precedent. So the same thing started happening in Argentina with regard to federal law and constitutional law. Until in the 40s or 50s, 20th century, this became a solemn doctrine of the Supreme Court. You could say we had a case analogous to your, 1970s case on jurisprudence constante. Mercury versus Johnson, I think it's called. We had a similar case in which now this soft obligation doctrine was coined. Soft obligation, which means at the vertical level that there is a general principle and an exception. So this is different from jurisprudence constante. It's also different from stare decisis, and it's different from there is no such thing as precedent. Here, your general principle, say you are the Federal Court of Appeals, is that the general principle is that you are bound by higher on-point precedent of the Supreme Court of Argentina. But this principle, we say, poses a juris tantum presumption, which we oppose in our civil law. Argentina, a civil law country, like Louisiana, a civil law state, we say it's juris tantum to contrast it with juris et de jure presumptions, which do not admit contrary proof. So what we mean when we say that there is a juris tantum principle that higher precedent ought to be observed is that in principle it ought to be observed, but if some circumstances, which I will explain subsequently, obtain, then you can make an exception to the principle. This, as far as we see, does not exist here. Or even here, where jurisprudence constante operates in a different way. Also, you will notice that this principle, this presumption, and the exception are unrelated to a number of cases, a line. So it's not like jurisprudence constante. There may be just one precedent on point, and there will be a presumption, juris tantum, that you ought to follow it. Unless, now you are a lower court, unless you can offer the Supreme Court, who will eventually review your decision, reasons to depart that, according to you, the Court of Appeals, have not been considered in that precedent. This is the doctrine of so-called new arguments. So the court is offering new arguments, it's covering new grounds because maybe the plaintiff pointed to them. Then the losing party will bring it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, under the new arguments doctrine, also known as soft obligation, will consider whether the Court of Appeals is lying, that is, they're rationalizing their preference to depart from higher precedent and invoking new arguments, which are not arguments, they are a lie, and then they will overturn the lower decision, invoking their own precedent, the Supreme Court precedent, or sometimes they will say, well, the Court of Appeals is spot on. We hadn't thought about that. So we will let it stand, or we will endorse it, or we will overturn it, but not because they departed from higher precedent, but because we think that although there were new arguments, this is wrongly decided, which is different, of course. So that's the soft obligation doctrine, and we think that from a certain perspective, the soft obligation doctrine is closer to the pure civil law system and to the systems in countries such as Italy and Spain than jurisprudence constante and the systemic respect of jurisprudence. We think this is closer to this side of the board because Louisiana is within a common law country, unlike Argentina, and therefore, even though the state courts in theory operate as the successors of a civil law system, court system, they are still very influenced by the common law methods. So this was actually something Chris understood earlier than I did. He was saying, yes, in Louisiana we may have substantive civil law, but the hierarchy of the court system and the contagious effect that comes from the fact that on one side of the street in Baton Rouge you have a state court, and 2 blocks further down you have a federal district court, and they'll have coffee together maybe. This will make these judges here, these state judges, more common law-like than the Argentine judges who belong in a civil law subcontinent. And we are still a civil law country with regard to everything but our constitution and our constitutional model. We have a civil code, a commercial code, like Italy, like France, like Louisiana, but Louisiana is in a common law country. So this is why we want to say that Louisiana is a tad closer to stare decisis and Argentina, a tad closer to the pure civil law model. But as I approach my conclusion, notice how they both belong in a halfway, in an imaginary halfway of sorts in between the two pure models. So that's very unique, we thought. And we thought too that it's quite striking that you could compare a state with a country. I don't know that you'll have many countries you can compare with this particular state, and certainly the other 49 states are irrelevant for our comparison. Because when I say USA here, and I say there is stare decisis, I mean, of course, at the federal level, but we also mean at the level of the other 49 states, which operate in effect for purposes of precedent in the same way as the federal judiciary does. It's only Louisiana who has this unique, and some people think crazy, situation where you have one leg in each of those two worlds. And we think that this is also true to some extent for Argentina. So I guess, Bill, if that's okay, I'll pause here and zip some water as I welcome comments, remarks. Yes, John.
Okay, one traditional explanation, in addition to what you're talking about in terms of the theory of soft adherence and jurisprudence, is the litigation method, is the method of litigation the way lawyers are trained, the way they operate in court, the way judges are trained. And even in Louisiana, we have a common law judicial methodology, even though they are supposedly interpreting the civil code. And I'm curious how much that also plays into your thinking. That again, courts or trials in Louisiana are common law trials. Trials in Louisiana have juries. Trial court judges in Louisiana act like common law judges. They're going to decide a civil law issue.
Yeah.
And I'm curious whether that constant immersion in common law methodology, in terms of just how lawyers and judges act, how much that feeds into what you're talking about as well.
Thank you. I think it does. And I think we could actually carve that into the argument nicely, because what we conclude is that it is the court system what in the end controls what happens in Louisiana, and not so much the law that has been applied. And in the same way, in Argentina, the court system, the court system, the methods are the civil law methods, which is the opposite of what you're saying by and large in Louisiana. So I think that's helpful to understand why, although in Argentina the structure of the judiciary is exactly the same, the way that judges and lawyers are trained here is closer to here, and the way you're telling me now they are trained here is closer to here. Thank you.
I have another question, but
Yes.
I would think in some cases it may be difficult to determine whether a court is accepting a new argument under a soft law theory versus the litigants have found a new fact or that might allow you, even in a common law system, to distinguish. What have you thought about that?
Thank you. In theory, the distinction is crystal clear. So we say distinguishing belongs in this world, and the new arguments, soft obligation doctrine, belongs in this world. And this distinguishing is about different facts, it's about analogy, disanalogy, and this is absolutely, in theory, unrelated to that. Because when they do this, when they depart under the soft obligation doctrine, they don't talk about the facts in theory. And in the same way, when they talk about the facts here, in theory, they will never tell you they don't like the law, although many times they do. So with us, it's more honest in the sense that this is what we say. This is less honest because many times it's clear that this is about your dislike and not about factual distinctions. But with us, it has to be something like this. The Supreme Court in that precedent had never addressed this normative question, which is intertwined to the ones decided in the past case, but it wasn't never addressed, and it changes completely everything. Not because this law wasn't there then, it was there, otherwise this is different. But because the Supreme Court, no one talked about this, maybe plaintiffs or whatever. So this is norms. It's the law in theory, what you're talking about, not the facts. I don't know if that's,
So the notion, this said, with the soft obligation, the parties could have raised the argument in the prior case,
oh yeah,
but they just didn't.
yeah.
And so, but had they raised it,
Yes, exactly. There are different parties, of course. Maybe this was 20 years ago.
right, no,
Maybe
that same
Yeah.
case came up before.
Yeah, but since you brought it up, and this has to do with John's one, with us, for this to happen, you won't need necessarily that a party is making the argument. If the Court of Appeals, notices that this is relevant normatively and new, they will do it on their own accord, ex officio, which, for an adversarial methodology, case of controversy, which we buy. We have the case of controversy requirement, but because our judges are trained in the civil law world, they'll say, oh, these guys forgot, but the law, iura novit curia, the law is the law. It doesn't matter if the lawyers forgot. I need to depart from precedent to uphold, something that is sacred.
Custom, equity, is that what you would say, they would say is sacred? That they didn't, we just didn't consider
No,
equity.
no. What I was hinting at is the law. This is what is sacred. The law has been violated 20 years ago, and I'm going to fix it, even if the lawyer forgot to ask me to fix it. And this is especially true when this is constitutional law we're talking about. Federal law we're talking about. Now, custom, however, thank you, is important because Matt Martin gave me this article, Custom as a Source of Law in Louisiana. This is last year, Gail Stephenson in the Louisiana Law Review, where she argues that jurisprudence constant is custom, really. So that's why custom can be relevant to the argument of binding force in a civil law system such as ours or Louisiana's, where custom is a source of law. There is no stare decisis, but then custom requires a repetition, then jurisprudence constant. I was talking to a friend last week. We were trying to figure where did the Supreme Court of Louisiana borrow the term jurisprudence constant from. I would be very grateful if you can supplement what my friend said to me. But not that this is in the Supreme Court decision, obviously, but he was saying to me that jurisprudence constant in French comes initially from international law, where of course custom is more important than anywhere else, even in the civil law world. Custom is blah, 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 in general, as Gail says in her. She wishes otherwise, but so in the international law field, then there is a requirement for there to be a precedent of the International Court of Justice that there is jurisprudence constant on that topic. Several decisions by the International Court of Justice. I found that very interesting, although I know that we will be able to, or we will need to bring that into the article, but if anyone knows more about the origins of the term of art, not of the practice of following precedent in the way a civil law jurisdiction does, which is very eclectic and confused and nice and beautiful, but rather the term.
The second question, Santiago, is kind of off topic, what you're talking about right now. I would distinguish between precedent in the traditional common law sense and precedent as it is used in constitutional law in the United States. In that the vertical use of precedent is absolutely, as you say, it is required. Cases like Cooper versus Aaron, once the Supreme Court interprets, everybody has to follow. But at the Supreme Court level, it seems to be there is a much greater willingness to rethink precedent. Not necessarily because it's a new argument, or not necessarily because it's new facts, but just the court sort of says, maybe we got it wrong the first time, maybe we need to think again. And my sense is, and you may know more about this than I do, that in traditional common law, courts didn't do that.
Yeah.
But in the U.S., when it comes to constitutional, and it strikes me that sense of wanting to go back to first principles, go back to the text, not necessarily at the highest level respect precedent simply because it's precedent, makes constitutional law in the United States, it's not a 9, it may not even be a 5 on your scale, but it may be like a 6 or a 7.
Yeah.
Whereas traditional common law may be a 10. Is that a distinction?
Yes, I agree with you. That is a relevant distinction. We tackle it in the article.
And I'm wondering, because you also indicated, I think, that in Argentina, constitutional law is treated differently than traditional civil law. And I'm wondering if on the constitutional law there isn't some kind of convergence here.
Yeah, okay, so Arthur Goodhart, an American who was the master of University College Oxford, while Herbert Hart was the professor of jurisprudence there, wrote an article, a famous article in 1934 on stare decisis in the Law Quarterly Review, and this is 2 years after the case Barnett versus Coronado Oil, which is so relevant for your point, where the dissent by Justice Brandeis carves the exception of constitutional matters out of stare decisis for reasons that would be difficult to explain in 5 minutes. And Goodhart is saying, wow, what they're doing in the US is so different from what he was American, we do here in the UK, where these matters would be under stare decisis like everything else. But John, those matters, Brandeis refers to in that dissent, which later became the word of God in the Supreme Court. Everyone disagrees. Casey, Planned Parenthood of Pennsylvania versus Casey is a perfect expose on how constitutional law matters should be outside the stare decisis rule. They refer the 32 case and Casey to horizontal stare decisis. When it comes to vertical, the fact that this is constitutional law is irrelevant, isn't it? So the lower court, state or federal, they'll say amen to what the Supreme Court says. In theory, in principle, we dare mention, of course this wasn't my idea, youth, boldness, the June Medical case, the ongoing case on abortion in the Fifth Circuit, and sometimes the lower courts, they take advantage of factual distinctions which are not there by no means to move on in a way in which maybe what is mattering is the nature of the law at stake, although at the vertical level this should be irrelevant, and it is irrelevant under stare decisis principles. Now in Argentina, John, the irony is that at the horizontal level, so there is a convergence in this point. We say in Argentina that because constitutional law matters so much, it is where precedent should be more stringent. And I think you would appreciate that perhaps. So it's not, they wouldn't apply the Brandeis rule and feel more free to overturn Roe v. Wade or whatever. They will just stick to it even more than they will do with civil law matters.
But the precedent matters more than it would in an ordinary civil law case, Argentina. And for constitutional law in the U.S., precedent matters less than it would in an ordinary common law or statutory case. Sounds like they're kind of meeting in the middle.
Well, in that respect, yes. Yes. Yes.
Apologies if this is
No.
covered.
No. I mentioned you earlier because I said Ignacio had come because of you. Had not come because of you.
Yes. Well, he did not come.
This is the punishment for us. You're very welcome.
You mentioned just now as you were talking about the concept of jurisprudence constant coming from international law, and I was wondering whether you had, I work on European issues and human rights and the sort of influence of supranational legal institutions on the sort of traditional ways in which civil law decisions are made, and the role that judges see themselves playing. And I was wondering if in Argentina you saw a similar transformation, if Argentina is, if the role of a judge in Argentina has changed as a result of being involved in more.
Oh dear, it has immensely. But you see where now this is not in our article, so I won't say we, I'll say I. I distinguish this reality we explain here of soft obligation. I distinguish it from regional law of human rights and the effects it has produced on the judges, especially in the way judges treat the decisions of the Human Rights Court in Costa Rica, or similarly as you said in Europe, because the way I see that is as a clearly legal or a clearly an authority of a clearly legal nature, where you are bound in a 100% way by the precedent of the regional court, if the regional court understands her decisions the way the Costa Rica does. So this is no soft obligation. You are ironically more bound by those decisions than by your own Supreme Court's decisions, under which you are under a soft obligation doctrine. This instead this is more like a legal moral obligation. But when you sign the Costa Rica Treaty or the Pact of Rome 1950, now this is the law. Is this the law? Well, it's a soft law. I mean, it's custom law. Well, if it is law, then this is law. But the other one is not custom. It's statutory law. It's in a treaty of legal nature. Of course, the treaty doesn't say that you're bound. But so the American Constitution doesn't say that you're bound by Supreme Court precedent, or the Argentine one. So that doesn't really matter. What does the Costa Rica court say? Oh my. Well, you know, your face is telling me everything.
So I wonder if you have thought about what the relationship there is between the definition of a state or a country as being one that is of common law and civil law or civil law, and the relationship between that and the sources of law. Why? Because if you look at taking John's example of the Constitution and the American Constitution, where the U.S. Supreme Court might be more willing not to follow precedent, because there is a written document, right? The same is true of what happens in civil law countries where we have the civil code. So there might be a connection there between the sources, the civil code, the written source, and what you define the level of civil law and common law that there is in that country. So I wonder if in your paper and in your research you have been discussing that and looking at the relationship between civil law and the source.
Thank you. There is a civilian in the room, I think. Yes, and we sadly perhaps conclude that it is less relevant what law you're applying. It is more relevant the way the judiciary is structured. That is in the end what controls the extent of the respect of precedent. But at the same time, of course, if you have written rules with more detail, your civil law judge will be able to start a case as they do in civil law countries minus Argentina, which is not looking at past precedent, but looking at the civil code, at our statutes, at the Constitution, as you said. And then we were talking about this in the truck as we drove earlier today from Clinton. And my driver, I won't say who it was, but he was saying that, yeah, this is how judges in the civil law world end up doing whatever they feel like doing, because the statute will leave many untouched things, and then the Supreme Court will have interpreted them, but, you know, there is no such thing as precedent, so, you know, I prefer to go in a certain way, and I'm really more free. The irony is that you're way freer in a world of written rules than in the other one, where in theory, you know, there's only just a bunch of things that are written there, but then you know that if you move a little bit, you know, like Kyle Duncan and colleagues have done in this Fifth Circuit case, then the Supreme Court by 5-4 will say, no, you know, you can't do that, although it's not written in the stars. We have a precedent from 3 years ago, so you better respect it. I don't know that they'll do that, but as there are new members in the court since then. So this will be an amazing test case for horizontal stare decisis, where people will be invoking perhaps Brandeis and Devlin and as reasons to overrule a case that has just been decided. What do you think, Joe?
I don't think that's what the litigants are going to be asking for. I actually did some moves to ago.
Uh-huh.
Preparing for this. They're structuring their argument not to ask for that. Now, again, the court can go anywhere they want.
Well,
But at least-
especially if they are civil law oriented on their own accord, if they want to overrule Roe v. Wade, this is a great opportunity for a step forward.
Liz is not asking for that. But can I ask a different question? Other more purely civil law countries, more purely civil law,
Yeah.
Italy and Spain,
Yeah.
when they interpret their own constitutions, is there the same move to giving more weight to precedent for constitutional law than they would for other things?
I don't know. I wouldn't know.
That would seem interesting.
Yeah.
If that were.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
From what I understand, you're describing the system as is in Argentina. So this soft precedent system you identify in Argentina is what you see in the reality. Some authors, I'm pretty sure you're aware of that, are suggesting that there is a doctrine of precedent in the making in Argentina, that this system is going to change to a system of precedent.
Yes.
First, do you agree with that? Second, do you think that that is a benefit to the system, or you would like that not to happen?
Thank you. He's my fellow countryman, Mariano. There are those who think that Argentina is moving toward a vertical stare decisis model, but there are also those, like the Chief Justice, the present Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who would say that the soft obligation doctrine should stay there forever. And if anything, we want to move a little bit toward the pure civil law system. Again, it's easy to guess why the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court would prefer to have his hands freer. So, who knows where it'll go. And what was the other question?
Do you think it is a benefit to go to that system, or you prefer this
Well,
one?
you know, like my co-author, he thinks that flexibility is better because there is less room for rationalization. I don't know. Before writing this article with Chris, I was more of the opinion that Argentina's system was implausible because we have a decentralized system of judicial review like the United States, but we don't have stare decisis. So how do you secure the uniformity of the interpretation of the law if all you have is this wishy-washy soft obligation doctrine? So I was always of the opinion that we should move towards stare decisis. But now that I perhaps know better about how the common law world operates and how behind distinguishing and those things, you know, you can hide other reasons, and then also how the common law methodologies can have more strictures than they appear to do have. I'm not so certain. I don't know.
Santiago, isn't it possible that just constitutional law is its own thing? That interpretation of constitutional documents, international human rights documents, it's not common law, it's not civil law, it's a further thing. And we shouldn't really be talking about common law methodology or civil law methodology. It is its own thing that requires a certain amount of precedent, but also a certain amount of flexibility.
Oh, it could be, but certainly not the case in the United States at the vertical level. The Supreme Court was always seen as a common law court. You know better than me. And then at the vertical level.
Vertically, yes, but if we go horizontally.
No, I'm not talking about horizontal now. Also, because what really matters, in my opinion, is vertical. Horizontal follows. And horizontal will always be more, as Brandeis says, a matter of policy. So the wisest policy will be stare decisis, but there will be lots of room for operation at the horizontal level, both in the US, in Argentina, I assume elsewhere. But what interests us more is the extent to which at the vertical level things are okay as they are, or if the question would be, to put it in your terms, is it good to do like Michael Stokes Paulson goes, that he says that at the vertical level, when constitutional law is at stake, there shouldn't be a stare decisis rule because there are conscientious matters at stake, there is a right to life, and so on. So it's best that the Court of Appeals be free from, say, Roe v. Wade or whatever. I'm not so sure that that would be a good idea.
I just wanted to make a small point that I think sort of responds to something you were saying about the question about how countries like Italy and other places deal with the constitutional issue. And this has sort of changed, but sort of at the pure level, it seems like the answer is they have a constitutional court, and that's different from their Supreme Court. And the constitutional court is the only place where constitutional questions can be asked.
So
And-
if
and
so, the methodology is different,
It's,
that's okay. That doesn't,
it's different because there's no need for vertical stare decisis because that's the only institution that can decide. So if you have a constitutional question, you have to send it to them. Obviously, that has somewhat altered because of the European supranational institutions and the interaction between constitutional law and international law, but that's the idea.
Taking that.
you can see hard vertical stare decisis in constitutional law in the United States as simply a necessary adaptation to the fact that we have decentralized constitution. So again, the question comes back to the part of stare decisis that really matters. I would simply be the horizontal border.
Yes, thank you for that compliment. I think it still leaves the question how the courts in the system of a centralized system of judicial review will treat the precedent of the Constitutional Tribunal, which is what I was saying to John. I couldn't offer him an answer to, because you see, his question could still be valid. He could say, well, it's one thing for the judge in Munich to treat the precedent on civil law matters of the Court of Appeals as if there were no such thing as precedent here, which is of course not true, but anyways. And then how about what the Constitutional Tribunal said on something that they can only deal with, but now I have a case that has some implications. How do I apply what they said? So
Then it's like the Costa Rica example.
yeah,
Then it's like,
it's, you're bound. Yeah, so it could be that there in that system, but not in the U.S., you have more adherence to precedent in vertical matters when constitutional law is at stake. Although it's not precedent, strictly speaking. I mean, these organs are outside of the judiciary, as you know. The way the members are appointed is completely different. They don't even do law, in a way, you could say. Now, in Costa Rica, the way I see it, but I have no opinions, is closer to a legal concept than a constitutional tribunal is, ironically, as it is seen. Because they are the head of a structure, of a pyramidal structure, which the constitutional tribunal is not. It's on the side. Now, I would prefer the Costa Rica court to be on the side, the way Bonn is, but they think they are a fourth instance in the system, although they deny it every year, every time they can, but they are. There is a great tension now between the Argentine Supreme Court and Costa Rica because of a case called Fontevecchia that has been coming and going. Who has the last word when you have a regional court of human rights? Of course, the United States, they know who has the last word, and therefore they do not recognize the jurisdiction of this court. Well, but I'm only being like Greg Smith, ironic. So no one will laugh. Thank you so much. I think, is it time or what?
Yes, thank you very much. And if you would like to send, I know you revised, if you wanted to send your paper, I know there are a number of folks.
Okay,
so that
wonderful.
see it very much. So,
Yes.
yeah.
Wonderful. I shall. We shall.
I'll be glad to circulate it if you want to send it to us.
Great. Whatever you see of brightness there is Corbett's.
Now, you can send the correct version before you go. Thank you.
Thank you so much.